A doctor once proved he could save nearly 1 in 5 patients from death. His own hospital fired him for it. In 1847, Ignaz Semmelweis worked in a maternity ward in Vienna. He noticed something that should have been obvious to everyone around him, and somehow wasn't. Doctors on his ward were performing autopsies in the morning, then delivering babies in the afternoon, without washing their hands in between. New mothers on that ward were dying of a violent fever at a rate close to 18%. A ward down the hall, staffed by midwives who never touched cadavers, saw a death rate closer to 2%. Semmelweis ran a simple test. He ordered doctors to wash their hands in a chlorine solution between the autopsy room and the delivery room. The death rate on his ward dropped from nearly 18% to about 1% within months. Not a small improvement. A collapse in mortality that any hospital administrator today would call miraculous. His colleagues hated him for it. Think about what his finding actually implied. It meant the doctors themselves, respected men with years of training, were the ones carrying death from the autopsy table to the delivery bed on their own hands. Accepting Semmelweis's data meant accepting that their own actions had been killing patients for years. That is not an easy thing for a proud professional to absorb, and most of them refused to. Hospital leadership dismissed his results as coincidence. Colleagues mocked him publicly. He eventually lost his position entirely, moved to a different city, and spent the following years growing increasingly desperate to be believed. He died in an asylum in 1865 at just 47, still trying to convince people who had already decided not to listen. Germ theory, which would have vindicated him completely, was not widely accepted by mainstream medicine for almost 2 more decades. This pattern eventually got its own name, the Semmelweis reflex. It describes the reflexive rejection of new evidence, not because the evidence is weak, but because accepting it would mean admitting that respected people were wrong, sometimes for years, sometimes at real human cost. Now let's slow down and actually pull apart why this reflex is so powerful, because the version most people tell stops at "people don't like being wrong," and that undersells what's actually happening. Look at this from 3 different angles, because each one reveals something the others miss. Start with individual psychology. When a doctor in 1847 was told his own unwashed hands might be causing death, that information didn't just challenge a professional opinion. It attacked his identity as a healer, the entire reason he'd chosen the job. Psychologists now understand this as identity protective reasoning. When evidence threatens something core to how a person sees themselves, the brain doesn't neutrally weigh the evidence. It looks for reasons to dismiss the source, the method, or the messenger, specifically so it doesn't have to sit with the implication. This isn't a character flaw unique to 19th century doctors. It's a completely normal human defense mechanism, and it activates hardest in exactly the people with the most professional pride at stake. Now look at team dynamics. Semmelweis wasn't just challenging individual doctors. He was challenging an entire ward's shared professional culture, the unspoken agreement that their methods were sound and their training was sufficient. When one person inside a group breaks that shared agreement with hard data, the group doesn't just have to process the data. It has to process the social discomfort of one member calling out the whole. Groups protect their own cohesion instinctively, often by isolating the person who disrupted it, rather than by changing the practice that person exposed. Semmelweis wasn't just wrong in his colleagues' eyes. He became the problem, a more comfortable target than the practice itself. And finally, look at the organizational incentive structure sitting underneath both of those layers. Vienna General Hospital's leadership had no institutional reward for admitting a mortality crisis on their own ward. Acknowledging it publicly meant admitting negligence, inviting scrutiny, and possibly facing consequences from above. Denial was, in a narrow and cynical sense, the path of least institutional resistance. The hospital's structure rewarded quiet continuity far more than it rewarded uncomfortable truth-telling, and Semmelweis paid the price for the mismatch. Now picture a version of this same mechanism playing out on a much smaller, much more ordinary scale, far from any hospital. A junior data analyst at a mid-sized company notices that a dashboard, the VP of sales built 2 years ago, the one leadership checks every Monday morning, has been quietly overcounting a key metric because of a join error in the underlying query. The analyst flags it politely in a meeting. The VP, who has presented numbers off that exact dashboard to the board a dozen times, doesn't say the analyst is wrong. He says the discrepancy is probably a data refresh timing issue, thanks the analyst for the diligence, and moves the meeting along. Nothing changes. 6 months later, someone else notices the same error, and by then the cost of unwinding a year and a half of miscounted numbers is far higher than it would have been the first time it was raised. That VP isn't a villain. He's running the exact same defense Semmelweis's colleagues ran 170 years earlier, just with less blood involved. Accepting the correction meant admitting that reports he'd personally stood behind, in front of people whose opinion of him mattered, had been wrong the whole time. The emotional math worked out the same way it always does. Deny quietly, and the discomfort disappears today. Accept it, and the discomfort is public and immediate. Here's the part managers most often miss when they hear a story like this, and it's the part that actually matters if you want to change your own team's behavior. The problem was never really about whether the evidence was clear. Semmelweis's evidence was about as clear as evidence gets, an 18-point swing in mortality with a single controlled variable. Clarity of evidence turned out to be almost irrelevant. What mattered was who benefited from the evidence being true, and who was threatened by it. A manager who assumes good data automatically wins because its good data is missing the entire mechanism. Data doesn't fight fair against threatened status. It rarely wins on its own. There's a nuance here worth being precise about, because it's easy to overcorrect once you understand the Semmelweis reflex. The lesson is not, always believe the newest, most disruptive claim because the establishment is probably wrong. That's just as sloppy a reasoning pattern in the opposite direction, and it would make an organization vulnerable to bad data, dressed up as bold insight. The actual discipline is separating the evaluation of a claim from the evaluation of who is making it and what it costs them personally to be right. Semmelweis's evidence deserved to be judged entirely on its own statistical merit, not on his seniority, his manner, or how uncomfortable his finding made anyone feel. That separation is the skill, not blind deference to whoever is loudest or newest. It's worth pausing on why doctors specifically found this so hard to accept, because the specificity matters. If Semmelweis had proposed a new type of forceps, a tool, an external object, his colleagues could have adopted or rejected it without any personal implication. But he was pointing at their own bodies as the vector of death. There's a category of finding that's uniquely hard to accept precisely because it implicates the person hearing it, rather than something external to them. Managers should learn to recognize that category specifically, because it's exactly where the Semmelweis reflex hits hardest. A finding that says, "This process needs improvement," lands very differently than a finding that says, "You personally have been the source of the problem," even when both findings point at the same root cause. Compare this to a scenario where a similar discovery landed completely differently. In several modern hospital systems that adopted checklist-based surgical protocols in the 2000s, following research led by physicians like Atul Gawande, initial resistance from surgeons was high for almost identical reasons. Wounded professional pride at being told a checklist could catch what their trained judgment sometimes missed. But in systems where hospital leadership explicitly reframed the checklist as a tool that protected surgeons from foreseeable human error, rather than as an indictment of surgical skill, adoption happened far faster and mortality dropped measurably. The evidence in both cases, Semmelweis's and the modern checklist studies, was comparably strong. The difference was entirely in how the threat to identity was managed by the people delivering the finding. Compare Semmelweis's story to a modern organization that actually managed to build immunity against this reflex, on purpose. Some hospital systems and airlines run what's called a blameless post-mortem process after a serious error, where the explicit ground rule is that naming what went wrong can never be treated as an accusation against the specific person who happened to be closest to it. The point isn't to remove accountability entirely, it's to separate the act of surfacing a problem from the act of being punished for it, so that the person most likely to have the clearest view of what actually happened has every incentive to describe it accurately instead of quietly protecting themselves. Organizations that adopt this structure consistently report catching smaller versions of a Semmelweis-style problem years before the equivalent of an 18% mortality rate would have forced the issue into the open on its Own. There's a name for the deeper psychological engine running underneath all of this, worth knowing because it reframes the whole problem. Researchers call it motivated reasoning, the tendency to evaluate evidence not on its actual merits, but on whether accepting it serves or threatens something the person already wants to believe about themselves. Motivated reasoning doesn't feel like bias from the inside. It feels like careful, reasonable skepticism. A doctor dismissing Semmelweis's chlorine handwashing data as probably coincidence genuinely believed he was being appropriately rigorous, not defensive. That's what makes this pattern so dangerous inside a modern company too. Nobody in the room ever announces, "I am rejecting this because it threatens my ego." They announce it as prudent doubt, careful due diligence, a reasonable request for more data before acting, and every one of those framings can be entirely sincere while still functioning as a shield against an uncomfortable truth. That comparison points directly at what a manager can actually do differently, starting with the very next piece of uncomfortable data that crosses their desk. Before judging whether a finding is credible, separate the messenger from the message completely, as a conscious first step, not an afterthought. Ask what the data actually shows, in isolation, before asking who found it, how senior they are, or how it makes anyone look. Then go one step further than most managers do. Actively look for ways to present a hard truth that don't require anyone to admit personal failure in front of an audience. Semmelweis never got that framing. His colleagues heard, "Your hands are killing patients," instead of, "Here's a small procedural change that would save more lives than anything else on this ward." And the first framing guaranteed defensive. Rejection before the data even got a fair hearing. There's also a longer-term angle worth considering, about how this same failure compounds over time inside an organization that never corrects it. Every time a team punishes or sidelines someone for proving a widely held practice wrong, the lesson every other employee quietly absorbs is not "that person was mistaken." It's raising inconvenient findings costs you your position. So don't do it. That lesson spreads far faster than any single policy memo, and it's almost invisible from the top, because the visible result isn't rebellion, it's silence. A team that has learned this lesson looks perfectly calm and cooperative in every meeting, right up until a much bigger, much more expensive problem finally surfaces publicly, because nobody felt safe raising it quietly first. One more angle worth sitting with is how a manager can build resistance to this reflex in themselves specifically, since managers are usually the ones with the most status to protect, and therefore the most personal incentive to reject uncomfortable findings. A useful habit is treating every instance of being proven wrong by a subordinate as a data point about the health of your own team's information flow, not just about the specific issue raised. If a junior person catches something you missed, the correct response isn't quiet embarrassment, it's active gratitude, expressed visibly enough that everyone else in the room notices how it was received. That visible reaction is doing more long-term work than the correction itself, because it's teaching everyone watching whether raising hard truths in this particular room is safe. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, about how the Semmelweis reflex scales with how much has already been invested in the practice being challenged. A brand new process gets challenged and changed easily, because nobody has staked much personal credibility on it yet. A 10-year-old process, championed publicly for a decade by people now senior enough to shape careers, gets defended far harder against exactly the same quality of contradicting evidence, because the cost of being wrong has compounded right alongside the seniority of whoever built it. This is part of why the most dangerous blind spots in any organization tend to cluster around whatever the most senior, most respected people have personally built or personally defended the longest. Nobody sets out to protect a bad practice forever. It just becomes progressively more expensive, socially and professionally, to be the one who finally says so out loud. It's also worth being precise about what actually breaks this cycle when it does break, because it's rarely one dramatic confrontation. Semmelweis himself tried confrontation, repeatedly and increasingly desperately, and it only entrenched the resistance further, since directly attacking someone's competence tends to trigger the exact identity protective reflex you're trying to dispel. Where this pattern has been successfully broken in modern organizations, the shift usually came from a third party with less personal stake walking in fresh, someone senior enough to matter, but distant enough from the original decision to have no ego invested in defending it, and reframing the finding in terms of forward-looking improvement rather than backward-looking blame. That distinction between "you were wrong" and "here's what would make things better starting now" sounds cosmetic, but changes the entire emotional calculation for the person hearing it. If you've ever watched your team go quiet right after someone raised something inconvenient, and you're now wondering whether that silence was actually agreement or just fear dressed up as agreement, that's worth sitting with before your next tough meeting. Drop a comment with the moment you first noticed the pattern in your own team. I want to hear how it actually showed up for you, because the shape it takes is rarely as obvious as it was for Semmelweis. There's a modern echo of this worth naming in how organizations treat internal safety data today compared to Semmelweis's era. Most companies now have some formal channel for reporting a process failure, an incident report, a post-mortem doc, a compliance hotline. The existence of the channel isn't the same as the channel working. A report that gets filed and then quietly buried in a shared drive nobody revisits produces the exact same outcome as no channel existing at all, except now the organization can tell itself the problem was addressed, which is arguably worse because it removes the pressure to build something that actually works.